The year was 1882. A small English town rested quietly beneath gray skies, where stone cottages leaned against the weight of time, and fields stretched endlessly into the distance. On those cold mornings, when the mist clung to the earth, the silence seemed eternal, broken only by the faint creak of a cart or the toll of a church bell. Life was hard but steady, marked by the rhythm of seasons, births, and deaths. Yet within this ordinary village, a story began that still unsettles those who dare to remember it. A story whispered in fragments, recorded in shadows, and preserved in a photograph that should never have existed. It was the story of Clara Evans, the child who returned after death. The Evans family was not wealthy, nor infamous. Farmers by blood, they worked the soil, raised animals, and endured the struggles of rural life in the late 19th century. They were a strange family only in hindsight, for no one suspected that their name would one day be forever tied to dark history, forgotten events, and an unsolved mystery that remains chilling even today. Clara was the youngest daughter. Small, pale, and unusually quiet, she was remembered as a child who lingered in corners, who observed more than she spoke. Some neighbors recalled how she sometimes muttered words in a tongue they could not recognize. A forbidden language, they whispered, a string of syllables no ordinary child should know. Others remembered her fascination with old photos, staring at them for long stretches, as though she saw something beyond the captured faces. Children in the village were drawn to her, and yet afraid. They played in the fields, but when Clara joined, the games grew tense. She always seemed distracted, answering questions no one had asked, laughing at invisible companions. The other children called her odd, but no one dared tease her for long. There was something unsettling in her pale gaze, something that made the laughter die quickly. By spring of that year, Clara fell ill. The sickness was swift and merciless. Some said it was consumption, others whispered of a curse. The Evans family watched helplessly as her strength faded. Within days, Clara's small body lay lifeless in her bed. She was 7 years old. The funeral was simple but solemn. The local church bell tolled, its mournful sound echoing across the hills. Villagers gathered, their voices low, their glances uneasy. The coffin was lowered into the earth, prayers were spoken, and the Evans family was left in grief. Death was no stranger to them. Many children were lost in those years, but there was something different about Clara's passing. Something that hung heavy in the air long after the final spade of dirt covered her grave. Time passed. The Evans family struggled to heal. They clung to one another, trying to rebuild their lives amid sorrow. And then, months later, came the day that would mark the beginning of their descent into legend. A photographer visited the village, offering family portraits, a rare luxury in those days. The Evans family, like many others, wished to capture their likeness, perhaps as a way of preserving what remained of their lineage. They dressed in their best clothes, stood stiffly in the parlor, and waited as the photographer adjusted his equipment. The camera clicked, and the moment was captured. When the photograph was developed, it revealed something that should have been impossible. There, among the family, stood Clara. Her figure was unmistakable. She was not blurred, not faint, but perfectly clear. She stood at her mother's side, her small hands folded neatly, her face pale yet vivid. Her eyes, fixed directly on the camera, seemed sharper than anyone else's in the image. And on her lips was the faint trace of a smile that unsettled every person who looked upon it. At first glance, the portrait seemed ordinary, like so many stiff family photos of the 19th century. But the more one stared, the more wrong it became. Eerie details revealed themselves. Clara's shadow did not fall in the same direction as the others. Her dress seemed pristine, untouched by wear, unlike her siblings' clothing. And her face seemed too alive, as though she alone knew the photograph held a secret. The Evans family was horrified. They had buried their daughter. They had watched her coffin lowered into the earth. And yet, here she was, immortalized in a photograph taken months after her death. The image soon became a source of obsession. Neighbors whispered. Some believed it was a trick of post-mortem photography. an old practice of capturing images of the dead, posed to look alive. But Clara had not been posed. She had not been exhumed. She had been gone for months. Others believed the Evans family had faked the image, though none could explain how. And still others, trembling as they spoke, swore they had seen Clara walking at dusk near the family's home, her pale figure drifting just beyond reach. The photograph passed quietly from hand to hand, each person shuddering as they studied it. It became one of those disturbing images people dared each other to look at. Some swore the longer you stared, the more Clara's eyes seemed to follow you. The Evans family, once ordinary, now carried a curse in the eyes of the village. Whispers grew. Was Clara truly gone? Or had she returned, carrying with her some hidden truth from beyond the grave? Her story, like many unsettling histories, would soon unravel into stranger tales, tales of voices in the night, of footsteps in empty halls, of a child's laughter heard where no child should be. In 1882, a girl died. But in that same year, she also returned, and the photograph was only the beginning. The Evans family was, on the surface, ordinary. Farmers bound to the soil, tied to the changing seasons of rain, harvest, and frost. Their lives were etched in the rhythm of hard labor and quiet devotion. To neighbors, they were simply another household in the countryside, neither wealthy nor poor, neither celebrated nor cursed. But history remembers them differently. They became a name whispered in connection with one of the most unsettling mysteries of the 19th century. A family forever marked by creepy storytelling, eerie details, and a child who should not have returned. The head of the household, William Evans, was a stern but weary man, his hands rough with years of work. His wife, Margaret, was softer in demeanor, though her eyes were shadowed with a quiet intensity. Together they raised several children, each expected to contribute to the family's survival. The Evans home was modest, a wooden frame, stone hearth, and a single upstairs room where the children slept together. It was in this house, with its flickering oil lamps and creaking floors, that the strange life of Clara unfolded. The Evans family carried no reputation for witchcraft, no rumors of heresy, no sign of madness. And yet, as later accounts suggest, there was always something different about their home. Neighbors recalled nights when strange lights glowed faintly from the upstairs window. Some swore they heard voices when passing late at night, soft whispers, not in English, but in some forbidden language no villager could identify. At first, such gossip was dismissed. Every town has its stories, and rural England was steeped in haunted places and sinister pasts. But after Clara's death and her mysterious reappearance in the family photograph, these whispers resurfaced with new strength. People began to look back on the Evans family and wonder, had the signs been there all along? Within the home, Clara was both cherished and feared. Her siblings adored her innocence, but spoke quietly of her peculiar ways. One brother claimed she often woke at night, staring toward the corner of the room as if speaking to someone unseen. Another recalled how Clara would vanish for hours, only to be found sitting silently in the fields, her hands pressed into the soil as though listening to the earth itself. Margaret Evans, her mother, defended her fiercely. She called Clara a sensitive child, blessed with imagination. But William grew uneasy. He was a man of the old faith, and to him, Clara's mutterings were not innocent. He warned her often, "Do not speak that tongue. It is not ours." But Clara never listened. She claimed she could not help it, that the words came to her like a song in the wind. Such unsettling behavior might have been forgotten had death not arrived so suddenly. After Clara's burial, the family's grief turned into something far darker. When she appeared again in that photograph, Margaret was convinced it was a miracle. She told neighbors that Clara had not been taken, only returned to them in spirit. William, however, saw it differently. He believed it was a sign of punishment, evidence that their household had been touched by something unnatural. The Evans home grew tense. Margaret clung to the belief that Clara was still with them, speaking of her in the present tense, setting aside food at the table as though her daughter might come to eat. William withdrew, avoiding the parlor where the portrait hung, as though unable to face the truth captured in that disturbing image. As for the other children, they lived in confusion and fear. Some whispered that they could still hear Clara's laughter in the halls. Others admitted to waking in the night to find the corner of the room colder, heavier, as if a shadow had settled there. The family, once ordinary, became prisoners of their own household, bound by the weight of an unsettling history no one could explain. The townspeople, too, began to change their perception. They avoided the Evans home. Children no longer played near the fields. Rumors spread that the family had invited Clara back through forbidden means, through prayers never spoken aloud in church, or rituals conducted in silence. Whether true or not, the whispers grew into fear. By late 1882, the Evans family was no longer seen as simply grieving parents, but as something more sinister, keepers of a secret that blurred the line between life and death. "Look closely at the family photograph," they said. "Look at William's stiff posture, Margaret's weary eyes, the siblings' nervous expressions. And then look at Clara, standing too close, smiling faintly, as though she alone understood what had happened." The Evans family was cursed, people believed. Not cursed by fortune, but cursed by their child who had returned. And within their walls, the line between grief and obsession began to erode. This was no longer just a family sorrow. This was the beginning of a descent into something darker, a story of shadows, whispers, and the kind of chilling secrets that are passed down only in hushed tones. The Evans family would never escape Clara, and the town would never forget them. But what came next was worse than a photograph. For after the image came the sightings. And after the sightings came the fear that Clara had truly walked among them again. Clara Evans was born into obscurity, a child destined to be remembered not for her life, but for the chilling echoes she left behind. Yet to understand the disturbing legend that surrounds her, one must first look closer at the girl herself, her habits, her words, her unsettling presence that left both family and neighbors uneasy long before her untimely death. From the moment she could walk, Clara seemed different. Where other children played freely, chasing one another through fields of wheat and meadow grass, Clara often stood apart, staring into the distance as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Her siblings called to her, tried to pull her into their games, but she would answer with silence, or worse, with strange phrases in a forbidden language no one understood. Margaret Evans, her mother, dismissed it as the product of imagination, saying Clara was simply clever and prone to daydreaming. But in the rigid and superstitious culture of rural England, imagination was not always a safe trait. Neighbors whispered that Clara was touched, perhaps cursed. And when she grew older, her behaviors only deepened these suspicions. Clara loved old photographs, though few families could afford them. Whenever the traveling photographer came to town, she would stare at his camera for hours, fascinated by the strange contraption. She once asked him if it could catch the voices too. The man laughed nervously, unsure whether it was a child's joke or something darker. When shown images of long-dead relatives, Clara lingered over them with unsettling intensity. One story claimed that she pointed to a photograph of a woman who had died decades earlier and whispered, "She still visits the house at night." How would a child know such things? No one could answer. Her personality was a contradiction. At times, she was gentle and kind, speaking softly to her younger siblings, comforting them when storms rattled the roof. But just as quickly, she could become withdrawn, muttering to herself, rocking back and forth, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room. Her father, William Evans, once scolded her harshly for these fits, insisting she stop speaking with shadows. Clara only smiled faintly, replying, "They don't like being ignored." These unsettling words spread quietly through the family. They were rarely spoken aloud beyond their home, for fear of ridicule or worse, suspicion from the church. Yet the Evans household grew tense with an unspoken fear. It was as if Clara knew something she should not have known. Accounts from villagers, passed down like fragments of a nightmare, describe moments that still trouble historians. One farmer swore he saw Clara walking alone at dusk, her lips moving as though reciting a prayer. but the words were unlike anything he had ever heard, low, rhythmic, and chilling. Another neighbor claimed she once heard Clara singing in the barn. When she looked inside, the child was alone, her voice echoing unnaturally, as if joined by a chorus no one else could see. And then there were the disappearances. Clara often wandered off without explanation, vanishing for hours. She would be found later in strange places, at the edge of the woods, by the cemetery gates, or kneeling near the river, her hands dipped into the water as though she were searching for something beneath the surface. When questioned, she gave vague answers. "I had to go where they called me." Despite all this, Clara's family loved her. Her siblings adored her strange stories, though they did not always understand them. Her mother clung to the belief that Clara was simply gifted, sensitive to things that others ignored. But William, the father, grew stern and fearful. He believed his daughter was a burden of shame, that her oddities brought danger to their household. Tension grew between husband and wife, between the desire to protect the child and the fear that she was cursed. By the time Clara was 7, her reputation as an unusual child had already taken root. Villagers avoided her when she passed. Children no longer invited her to play. Even the priest, when speaking to William privately, advised prayer and watchfulness. Such children, he warned, were vulnerable to temptation and to forces best left unnamed. And then, the sickness came. It began with a cough, faint at first, then worsening by the day. Clara grew pale, her frame weakening. Margaret refused to believe it was serious, but William accepted it grimly as inevitable. Within a week, Clara lay in her bed, her breath shallow and ragged. Family and neighbors gathered, whispering prayers, but Clara seemed detached, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She spoke softly in those final hours, muttering words no one understood. Some swore her last sentence was not in English at all. Others claimed she simply smiled, as if seeing someone familiar in the room. When death finally took her, the house fell silent. The Evans family mourned, and the town whispered in relief. For some, Clara's passing meant peace. Yet for others, it was only the beginning of a sinister past, one that would soon resurface in the most disturbing way imaginable. Clara's life had been short, strange, and filled with moments that unsettled everyone who knew her. But her death, far from silencing the whispers, only amplified them. For when she appeared once more, in that infamous family photograph, her peculiar childhood began to make a horrifying kind of sense. The Evans family had not been raising an ordinary child. They had been living with a mystery that would not end at the grave. Death came swiftly to Clara Evans. In the early summer of 1882, the Evans home was filled with the sounds of coughing. It began as a faint irritation in Clara's chest, an ordinary illness. It seemed one that would pass with rest and warm broth. But within days, her condition worsened. Her breaths grew shallow. Her once bright eyes dimmed, and her small body, once restless with strange energy, lay limp and exhausted. Neighbors remembered Margaret Evans, her mother, walking through the village markets with eyes red from weeping, pleading with anyone who might have remedies. William Evans, her father, sat silently on the porch, smoking his pipe, his face heavy with resignation. In those days, sickness was a cruel companion, and death claimed many children without warning. Yet with Clara, it felt different. Those who visited the Evans household during her final days spoke of eerie details that defied explanation. One woman claimed that as Clara lay feverish, she whispered in that same forbidden language she had been known to use as a child. Others said she called out names of people who had long been dead, relatives she could not have remembered. A neighbor swore that while tending to the sick girl, she felt an unnatural cold spread through the room, though the summer air outside was sweltering. Margaret clung to her daughter's side, refusing to believe the illness was fatal. She prayed over Clara, kissed her forehead, and promised she would recover. But William stood apart, his eyes dark with fear. Some whispered that he believed Clara's sickness was not of the body, but of the soul. On the third day of her illness, the child's condition became unbearable. Her breathing slowed. Her lips trembled with faint words that no one could understand. Some claimed she smiled at something unseen above her bed. Others swore she lifted her hands as though reaching for a figure no one else could see. And then, as the church bell struck midnight, Clara exhaled her final breath. The Evans home fell into silence. Margaret collapsed in grief, her cries echoing into the night. William closed the shutters and refused to speak. The siblings, frightened and confused, huddled together in the upstairs room, their young minds struggling to understand what had happened. The next morning, the villagers prepared for the funeral. In the 19th century, post-mortem photography was a common practice. Families often posed their dead in photographs as a way of remembering them. And though Clara's death shook the Evans household, Margaret insisted on no such thing. She wanted no reminder of her daughter's lifeless body. She wanted only to remember Clara as she had been. Strange, yes, but alive. The coffin was small, built by William himself from rough wood. Clara's body was washed, dressed in white, and laid within. Neighbors filed past, their expressions solemn, though many could not resist a quiet murmur. Some felt sorrow, but others felt unease, as if Clara's death had brought an unnatural stillness to the village. The funeral procession was simple. The family walked behind the cart that carried the small coffin to the churchyard. The priest read the final rites, his voice trembling as he spoke the words. It was said that as the coffin was lowered into the ground, the air grew colder, a sharp wind cutting across the mourners. Some looked at one another nervously, but no one spoke aloud. And then, it was done. The grave was filled, the earth pressed firm, and the Evans family returned home in silence. Clara Evans had been buried. She was gone. At least, that was what everyone believed. For in the days that followed, strange events began to unsettle the Evans household. Margaret claimed she heard the soft sound of a child's laughter in the halls. One of the siblings swore he felt Clara's hand brush against his in the dark of night. And William, though he never spoke of it openly, was seen standing by the grave at odd hours, staring at the freshly turned soil as if expecting it to move. The villagers tried to comfort them, but fear was already spreading. Some whispered that Clara had not truly died, that she had slipped into some other state, neither alive nor dead. Others believed the family had been cursed, punished for some hidden sin. And then there were those who feared something worse, that Clara herself had chosen not to remain in her grave. But the most disturbing detail was yet to come. Months later, when the Evans family gathered for their new portrait, Clara appeared again, standing among them, alive in the photograph, her pale face frozen in time. Her death, it seemed, had not been an ending at all. It had only marked the beginning of one of history's most unsettling mysteries. The town buried a child in 1882. But what returned in her place was something no one could explain. The year was still 1882. Summer had faded into autumn, and the Evans family carried a silence that unsettled their neighbors. Clara was gone, buried beneath the churchyard soil, but her presence still lingered in the halls of that modest home. At night, Margaret swore she heard a child humming faintly. The siblings whispered about footsteps in their room, even though their sister's bed stood empty. And William, though he remained stoic, drank more heavily than before, as if drowning something he dared not speak aloud. Then came the day of the photograph. It was William's brother, Thomas, who had suggested it. A family portrait, he said. To preserve memory, to show strength. Photography in the 1880s was no longer rare. It had become a way for families to cement their existence in a single frame. But within villages like theirs, photographs carried something more. A superstitious weight, a frozen reminder of life itself. Some whispered that photographs stole pieces of the soul. Still, Margaret agreed. She wanted something to hold on to. The photographer was a quiet man from a nearby town, traveling with his cumbersome equipment. He set up his black cloth and brass camera in the Evans parlor. The children were dressed in their finest clothes. William stood behind them, his face pale, his hands clenched. Margaret, though weary, tried to smile faintly. The room was hushed as the man adjusted the lens and told them to hold still. At first glance, the photograph seemed ordinary. A grieving family, their expressions solemn but composed, frozen in time. But when the plate was developed, something was wrong. Look closely. Behind Margaret, standing slightly apart from the others, was a child, a girl in a pale dress. Her eyes stared directly into the camera, unblinking. Her face was unmistakable, thin lips, sharp chin, the same curious eyes that neighbors had always described. It was Clara. The Evans family had buried her weeks earlier, yet here she stood, captured in silver nitrate. The photographer swore he had seen nothing unusual during the session. He insisted no child had entered the room. William, trembling, accused him of some cruel trick, but when the man examined his own glass plate, he turned white. "I cannot explain this," he muttered. The family gathered around the image, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with terror. Margaret broke down, sobbing, convinced that her daughter had returned, not in body, but in spirit. One of the younger children screamed that Clara had been in the room the entire time, though no one else had seen her. Word of the photograph spread quickly through the village. Some believed it was a case of post-mortem photography, an old practice where the dead were propped up for final portraits. But this was not the case. Clara had already been buried. Her coffin lay beneath the earth. No one had exhumed her body, and in the image, she did not look lifeless. Her eyes were bright, her expression calm, as though she had simply returned to stand among her family once more. Others suggested trickery, that the photographer had used double exposure to create the illusion. But why? He was a simple man, hardly known for theatrics. And why would the family risk humiliation by spreading a falsehood? No matter the explanation, the photograph became a source of dread. Some refused to look at it, claiming that those who stared too long into Clara's eyes would dream of her for weeks. One villager claimed the photograph changed each time he saw it. Sometimes Clara's hands were clasped, sometimes they hung at her sides, as if the image itself was restless. Within the Evans home, the photograph was hidden away. Margaret could not bear to destroy it, but William demanded it be locked in a wooden chest. Still, the children whispered that at night they heard scratching noises from inside that chest, as though the picture itself longed to be freed. Theories spread. Some believed Clara had been buried alive, her spirit restless because she had not been properly mourned. Others whispered of a family curse, tied to the strange forbidden language Clara had spoken in her final days. And there were darker rumors still, that the Evans had invited something unnatural into their home, and that the figure in the photograph was no longer Clara at all, but something wearing her face. Whatever the truth, the photograph marked a turning point. It was no longer just a story of a child's tragic death. It had become an unsolved mystery, a piece of dark history that blurred the line between life and death, between sorrow and horror. For decades, fragments of the Evans family story would circulate in whispers, but always the same detail remained constant. The image of the child who had returned after death, staring forever into the lens of that camera. And though the original photograph is said to be lost in time, hidden away or destroyed, its legend remains. Some claim copies exist in private collections, guarded carefully, feared more than cherished. Others insist that to even possess such an image is to invite Clara's presence into your home, because the photograph was not just a record of grief, it was a window. And sometimes, windows do not only allow us to look in, they allow something else. To look back. The photograph of Clara Evans should have remained a private family matter, yet in a village as small as theirs, secrets never lasted long. Within days, whispers spread from the Evans home to the marketplace, from the church steps to the tavern door. People spoke cautiously, lowering their voices, as if the walls themselves might be listening. It began with curiosity. Neighbors asked to see the image. They claimed they wanted to comfort the grieving mother, to pay respect to a lost child, but curiosity turned to unease the moment they looked at it. Clara's eyes, those sharp, haunting eyes, seemed alive, burning into the viewer's soul. Some swore she smiled faintly when the photograph was tilted toward the light. Others claimed her face appeared clearer than that of her living family, as if the dead girl was more present than the living. Soon, the whispers grew darker. The Evans family had always been considered unusual. Their daughter's strange behavior, the way she spoke in a forbidden language, the way she stared at corners where no one stood, was now remembered with dread. Townsfolk muttered that the Evans home was cursed. Some mothers pulled their children away when Margaret passed in the market. Others crossed themselves when William walked by. And then came the rumors. One claimed Clara had not been truly buried, that her grave had been tampered with, her coffin empty. Another insisted Margaret had bargained with dark forces to bring her child back. A third whispered that the Evans family themselves were no longer human, but shadows in human form, hollowed out by the unnatural. The photograph became a relic of fear. Though locked away in a wooden chest inside the Evans home, villagers swore it was not contained. Some claimed to see Clara's figure wandering the road at dusk, her pale dress fluttering though no wind stirred. Others said they heard laughter in the churchyard, high and soft, coming from her grave. A farmer's wife declared she woke to find muddy footprints outside her window, small, childlike, leading toward the Evans house. Margaret clung desperately to faith, insisting Clara's appearance was a blessing, a sign her daughter had returned in spirit. William, however, fell silent. He avoided the tavern, avoided the church, avoided the eyes of the townsfolk. He sat on the porch in the evenings, staring into the road, pipe smoke curling in the chill air, as if waiting for something he dreaded but could not stop. Children, as they often do, carried the cruelest whispers. They dared one another to creep near the Evans home, pressing ears against the windows to hear the sounds of faint singing. They mocked the Evans siblings, calling them ghost kin and grave brood. Some said Clara's brothers and sisters no longer looked quite right, that their eyes had grown darker, their smiles too forced. Even the priest, who was sworn to offer comfort, kept his distance. In sermons, he spoke vaguely of sins that invite the devil, of unnatural attachments that disturb the peace of the dead. He never named the Evans family, but all knew whom he meant. By winter, the family was isolated. Few came to their door. No one offered help when the roof began to sag under the weight of snow. The Evans children, once seen laughing with others, now walked alone, heads down, as villagers crossed the road to avoid them. The family was no longer just grieving, they had become outcasts, shadows among their neighbors. But what frightened the town most were the strange happenings no one could explain. At least 3 villagers claimed to see Clara in the flesh, wandering the cemetery late at night. One old man swore she stopped at his gate, looking in with hollow eyes, before vanishing when he called her name. Another said she knocked on his door, but when he opened it, only silence and cold air greeted him. Some dismissed these tales as drink-fueled imagination, but others believed them wholeheartedly. The whispers grew into warnings. Do not look at the Evans home after dark. Do not walk past Clara's grave at midnight. Do not let your children speak her name. Fear gave way to anger. The villagers began to say the Evans had brought something unnatural upon them all. Misfortunes, failed crops, stillborn livestock, sudden sicknesses, were blamed on the family. Each tragedy was tied back to Clara, as though her death and her return had opened a door no one could close. And then the whispers turned into threats. A few men muttered about burning the photograph. Others spoke of digging up the grave to prove Clara was truly gone. The Evans family was no longer safe in their own town. The chilling truth was this: whether Clara had truly returned or not, the village believed she had. And belief, in such times, was as powerful as fact. For the Evans family, isolation was only the beginning. The next chapter of their story would descend into something far darker than whispers. The whispers in the town might have remained whispers, half-believed stories, fueled by fear and grief, if not for what happened that winter inside the Evans home. It began quietly, with small things. The sound of footsteps across the upstairs hallway when the children were asleep. The faint hum of a lullaby, the same one Margaret used to sing to Clara, now drifting through the house when no one's lips moved. A wooden toy buried with the girl, found one morning at the foot of her sibling's bed. At first, Margaret insisted it was memory. Grief could play tricks on the mind, but William grew pale and silent. He had seen the toy himself. He had heard the soft, childlike laugh echoing through the parlor when he sat alone in the dark. One evening, Margaret entered the room carrying a lamp. She swore she saw Clara sitting at the table, her small hands folded neatly, her hair falling across her shoulders. For the briefest moment, the child looked solid, alive, as though nothing had ever happened. But when Margaret gasped and dropped the lamp, Clara was gone, the only trace of her a faint indentation in the chair's cushion. From that night forward, the house was never quiet. Neighbors avoided walking past after sundown, claiming they saw a girl's pale face staring from the upstairs window. One man swore he heard knocking on the glass as he hurried past, though every member of the Evans family was known to be asleep at the time. Inside the home, the siblings were terrified. They spoke of waking to see Clara standing at the foot of their beds, her expression calm, her eyes unblinking. Sometimes she said nothing. Other times she whispered their names in a voice that sounded both near and far, as though carried by the wind itself. The Evans' youngest child, barely 4 years old, began speaking to someone unseen. When asked, he replied simply, "Clara." Margaret, torn between hope and terror, began to believe her daughter had truly returned, not in spirit alone, but in some impossible, physical way. She confessed to William that she dreamed of Clara every night, dreams so vivid they left her trembling. Sometimes Clara asked why her family had put her in the ground. Sometimes she begged to be let back inside the home fully, no longer wandering between two worlds. William rejected this hope. He told Margaret that what they saw was not their daughter, but something else, something that wore Clara's face. He warned her never to speak aloud to the figure, never to invite it closer. But Margaret, desperate and broken, could not resist. The turning point came on a storm-heavy night in December. Lightning cracked over the village, rain lashing against the windows. The Evans children huddled together upstairs, too afraid to sleep. Margaret sat in the parlor, clutching the locked chest that held the photograph. She said later she felt Clara's presence in the room, so strong she could almost feel the girl's breath against her cheek. And then, as thunder shook the house, there came a knock at the door. 3 soft raps. The kind a child would make. William rose to answer, but Margaret stopped him. Her face pale, her eyes wet with tears, she whispered, "It's her." The knocking came again. Louder this time. William, trembling, reached for the latch. He pulled the door open wide, letting in the storm's cold fury. And there, standing in the rain, was a figure. A child. Small, pale, dressed in a white gown that clung to her thin frame. Her hair was soaked, plastered to her face. Her lips were parted, but no breath steamed in the cold night air. It was Clara. She lifted her head slowly, eyes locking onto her parents. For a moment, silence ruled. Only the storm moved, only the rain spoke. And then, in a voice that was both hers and not hers, she said, "Why did you leave me there?" Margaret collapsed to her knees, sobbing. William slammed the door shut, his body shaking as though he had seen not his daughter, but something far darker. The sound of Clara's voice lingered, muffled through the wood, repeating the same question again and again. When the family awoke the next morning, the earth outside the home was marked with small, wet footprints, footprints that led from the road to the doorstep, but never away. From that night on, there was no longer any doubt. Clara Evans had returned, but what she had become was something no one could explain. By the time Clara Evans had been seen at the Evans doorstep, whispers were no longer enough. The story had grown too large, too dangerous, and too strange to remain within the village. Outsiders began to arrive, men of science, men of faith, and men chasing profit from the macabre. Each came with their own purpose, their own explanation for what had become of the Evans family. The first to arrive was Reverend Thomas Hargreaves, summoned from a neighboring parish. He was stern, severe, and carried the weight of authority in his black coat and Bible. He dismissed the townsfolk's hysteria, claiming grief had led to delusions. Yet when he visited the Evans home, he left pale and shaken. He refused to speak of what he had seen, but villagers swore they heard him muttering prayers under his breath for days after. Then came the physician, Dr. Alfred Maynard, a man of science, skeptical and dismissive of anything beyond the natural. He examined the photograph, declaring it a mere double exposure, a trick of the camera. Light and shadow, he said coldly. Nothing more. But when pressed to explain how the figure bore such uncanny clarity, how her eyes seemed to follow the viewer, how her face appeared more vivid than the living, his confidence faltered. A trick, he repeated. A trick, nothing else. But the villagers were not convinced. Soon after, a man claiming to be a photographer himself visited the Evans home. He demanded to see the original glass plate. William, reluctant but cornered, brought it forth. The man studied it under lamplight, tracing the contours of Clara's face with trembling fingers. "This is no trick," he whispered. "No exposure of mine has ever captured something like this." He refused to elaborate further, leaving the village before nightfall, never to return. Meanwhile, journalists caught wind of the story. A newspaper from the city sent a reporter, eager to document a tale of rural superstition. He interviewed villagers, collecting testimony of Clara's strange return. But his article, when published, mocked the Evans family as simple folk, deceived by grief and shadows. He called the photograph a case of peasant ignorance, reducing a haunting mystery to ridicule. And yet, those who read the article were struck not by his words, but by the image reprinted alongside them. Clara's face, reproduced in grainy ink, still carried that same unsettling clarity. Readers swore her eyes seemed alive, even on cheap newspaper stock. Some tore the paper to shreds rather than keep it in their homes. The Evans family endured these intrusions with quiet suffering. Margaret clung to the belief her daughter's return was real, even holy. William grew withdrawn, convinced that what lingered in their home was no longer their child. Their children, caught between whispers, investigators, and nightly terrors, fell silent, their youth consumed by fear. Skeptics demanded proof. Some called for Clara's grave to be exhumed. But William refused. "She rests," he said sternly, "and I will not disturb her." His refusal only fueled more speculation. What if the grave was empty? What if the coffin contained nothing but soil and stone? At last, a small group of villagers, emboldened by fear and drink, decided to act without permission. Under the cloak of night, they crept into the churchyard with spades and lanterns. They began to dig, but before they reached the coffin, a sound froze them in place. A child's laugh, soft, high, and unmistakable. It echoed through the graveyard, though no child was near. The men fled, abandoning their tools in the dirt. By morning, the priest declared the grave sacred ground, forbidding any further attempts. The villagers obeyed, but the rumor spread. Clara's coffin had never been opened, and perhaps never would be. The investigations, the skepticism, the ridicule, it all left the Evans family more isolated than ever. Believers and skeptics alike looked upon them with suspicion. Some feared them, others pitied them, but no one dared grow close. And still, the strange occurrences continued. Margaret swore she saw Clara reflected in the window glass, even when no one stood outside. One sibling claimed Clara whispered secrets to her in dreams, secrets about neighbors' sins, secrets no child could possibly know. William, his resolve breaking, admitted he felt Clara's hand on his shoulder at night, small and cold, as if she had come to comfort him, or to remind him. The investigators came and went. The skeptics spoke and wrote, but none could silence the chilling truth. Explanations failed, while the fear only deepened. For the Evans family, the world outside had turned against them. But inside their home, something far worse was waiting. And what came next would blur the line between skepticism and belief forever. By the winter of 1883, the Evans family was no longer the same. The death of Clara had broken them, but her strange return had destroyed them. What began as whispers in the village and shadows in the hall had become something far more corrosive, a slow unraveling of mind, body, and spirit. Margaret, once proud and resilient, was consumed by obsession. She spent hours in the parlor with the locked chest that held Clara's photograph. At times, Neighbors peered through the windows and swore they saw her speaking to it, whispering in tones both tender and desperate. She grew thin, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling as though she had not slept in weeks. She insisted Clara was with her still, watching, waiting to be welcomed back fully. Some nights she sat an extra place at the dinner table, murmuring prayers to a daughter no longer of this world. William bore the weight differently. Silent, gaunt, and angry, he turned to drink with increasing ferocity. In the tavern he was avoided, his presence heavy, his words slurred with bitterness. He muttered that his wife was bewitched, that the figure haunting their home was not their daughter, but something far more sinister. On stormy nights, he sat on the porch with his shotgun, claiming he would end whatever wore Clara's face if it dared return again. Yet when confronted with shadows in the house, he froze. His strength had turned to fear. The Evans children fared no better. The youngest, once playful, had fallen silent. He often sat staring at corners, eyes wide, as though watching someone unseen. The elder siblings whispered of waking in the night to find Clara's small figure at the foot of their beds, her pale face inches from theirs. One girl confessed to her mother that Clara had spoken to her in dreams, secrets whispered in that same forbidden language that no one else could understand. Margaret took this as a blessing. William took it as proof that the family was cursed, and the house itself seemed to decay with them. Doors creaked open though no hand touched them. The air grew colder in the halls, even as fires roared in the hearth. Strange markings appeared on the wooden beams, scratches too high for children, too deep for nails. Food spoiled too quickly, animals refused to approach the home, and even the priest who once offered prayers at the door now kept his distance. The villagers, once curious, now kept away entirely. They whispered that the Evans home was haunted, that to step across its threshold was to invite Clara's restless spirit, or worse, something darker, into one's own life. Children were forbidden to play near the property. Adults crossed themselves when passing. The family lived in isolation, abandoned by community, consumed by dread. By the spring of 1883, Margaret no longer left the house. Her face had grown pale, her voice weak, yet her devotion to Clara's presence only deepened. "She is not gone," she told anyone who dared visit. "She is still here. She is waiting for us." The villagers avoided her words, but in private they whispered that Margaret herself was being hollowed out, piece by piece, by the child she refused to release. William grew violent. One night, neighbors reported hearing shouts from the Evans home, Margaret crying, William screaming that she was inviting it inside. Days later, he was seen with bruises on his arms and a haunted look in his eyes. Some claimed he tried to burn the photograph but failed, for the flames sputtered and died the moment the image neared them. Margaret, they said, clutched the chest protectively, swearing that destroying the photograph would damn Clara forever. The children, trapped between their parents' warring beliefs, slipped further into fear. Their laughter was gone, their voices subdued. They moved like shadows through the halls, exhausted, pale, and distant. One neighbor who glimpsed them described their faces as hollow-eyed, like children who belonged more to the grave than to the living. And still, Clara came, sometimes as a fleeting figure in the window, sometimes as laughter drifting through the night, sometimes as whispers in the dark. The Evans family was unraveling under her shadow, torn apart by grief, fear, and the unbearable possibility that the child they buried had never truly left. By midsummer, the Evans household had become a place of dread even for those who had once defended them. Some villagers urged the priest to intervene, to banish the spirit that haunted the family. Others muttered that the only way to end it was to burn the home to the ground. But nothing was done. Fear paralyzed them all. The Evans family stood alone, trapped inside their decaying home with the presence of the girl they had lost, and perhaps the thing they had unknowingly welcomed back. The decline was not sudden. It was slow, suffocating, inevitable. By the time the family realized they were being consumed, it was already too late. For what had once been whispers in the town had now become screams inside the Evans home. And the final nights were yet to come. The year was 1884. By then, The Evans family was no longer spoken of with pity but with dread. Their home, once a modest farmhouse on the edge of town, now stood as a symbol of ruin, a decaying shell whispered about by villagers who crossed the road rather than walked too close. For inside that home lingered a story that no one dared retell aloud, except in hushed voices around the fire, long after dark. The family itself had all but vanished. William was found wandering the fields one morning, clothes torn, eyes wild. He muttered incoherently of shadows that spoke his name, of footsteps behind him that left no prints. When asked about his wife and children, he fell silent. Some say he fled, never to return. Others claim he was taken to an asylum, where his final words, repeated endlessly, were, "She will never let us go." Margaret's fate was darker still. Neighbors said she refused to leave the parlor, her frail body hunched over the chest that held Clara's photograph. The smell of decay seeped from the house, and when villagers finally forced their way inside, they found her lifeless, slumped in her chair, the photograph clutched to her chest. Her eyes were open, as though fixed on something that still stood before her. The priest who arrived that day would later confide, pale-faced, that the photograph looked altered, that Clara's expression had changed, her once serene face now curled into the faintest of smiles. As for the remaining children, their fates became part of the town's whispered mythology. Some say they were taken in by distant relatives, their lives forever scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. Others claim they simply disappeared, vanishing one night without a trace, leaving behind only the faint sound of children's laughter echoing in the hall. The Evans house itself became a place of terror. Abandoned, it stood untouched, its windows shattered, its walls marked with strange carvings. Villagers told stories of eerie lights flickering in the night, of the sound of a little girl humming from inside the rotting walls. Few dared to approach, but those who did claimed the air was unnaturally cold, and that the photograph of Clara still remained in the chest, untouched by time, her pale face staring back with lifeless eyes. But Clara's story did not remain buried in that decaying home. Decades later, researchers of the paranormal would uncover fragments of her tale. Old parish records, scattered news clippings, and half-burned diaries spoke of the Evans child who returned from death. Among these documents were disturbing details, sightings of Clara in the town long after her burial, villagers swearing she passed them in the street, her figure pale, her smile distant, her presence undeniable. Even into the early 20th century, strange reports persisted. Travelers described a young girl in outdated clothing wandering the countryside, asking in a faint, almost inaudible voice, "Have you seen my family?" Those who claimed to see her often fell ill in the days after, plagued by fevered dreams of a child standing at the foot of their bed. And still, the photograph endured. It passed through hand, sometimes sold at auctions, other times stolen or lost, but always resurfacing. Each new owner reported strange phenomena, unexplained chills, whispering voices, even the faint sound of a child crying when no one else was near. Some swore the image itself shifted, Clara's eyes following them in the dark. To this day, no one knows what Clara Evans truly was. Was she a restless spirit, tethered to her grief-stricken family? Was she something darker, a presence wearing the face of a child to gain entry into the world of the living? Or was she nothing more than a figment of madness, the cruel manifestation of grief and superstition in a time when death was all too common? What we do know is this: the story of Clara Evans became a legend, a tale passed down through generations as a warning. It speaks of the dangers of clinging too tightly to the dead, of gazing too long into the face of grief, and of inviting shadows into one's home that should remain locked away. Look closely at the few surviving photographs from that era. At first glance, they may seem ordinary. But in the faded corners, in the blurred faces, and in the unnatural stillness of the children captured forever in black and white, you may catch a glimpse of something more, something watching, something waiting. And if, late at night, you ever come across the photograph of a young girl said to be Clara Evans, do not look too long. Do not listen if you think you hear her voice, for once you see the details, you may find her smile staring back at you in the dark, The Evans family is gone. The house has crumbled, but the legacy of Clara Evans, the child who returned after death, remains. And perhaps it always will. Some stories are never buried. Some children are never truly gone. And some photographs should never be looked at twice.